Hello, everyone. I'm back again. We're in chapter 4 now. Chapter 4 is going to have a lot different feel than any other chapter we've done. A lot of discussion. You're going to do a lot of reading. It's just all, if you open up the book and look at the chapter, it's all reading. It's all words. It's about experiments and observational studies and data and that. So I'm just going to talk a lot. It's going to be kind of a little weird chapter in terms of that. And you're going to write a lot. So section 4.1 is about samples. So we're gonna, this is kind of the introduction to what we're gonna be doing the rest of the course. So samples, we take samples all the time in statistics and we learn from those samples. So we're gonna talk a little bit today about how to take a good sample, all right? So why do we take samples, first of all? And so in statistics, we do this all the time. And the main reason we take samples is to help determine information about the population. We have to learn in this class what that means, and can we really just take a sample of 100 people and say, hey, this is what's going to happen with the population? And there is some power to that, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as we go through this class. So it helps determine information about the population without having to ask everyone. So it saves a lot of time, a lot of cost. A lot of times in products, like if you owned a company and you're making something and you want to see if the things are working right, you have to sample those things. But the problem is often when you sample things, you can't sell them afterwards. So you destroy the product. Or if you're doing like a crash dummy in a car or something like that, we ruin a car. You can't crash every car to see how it handles. You just crash a couple of them and you learn something about the population. All right. So we can sometimes we can get even more out of it because it saves a lot of time. So we can get more information. Okay, so that's why we take samples. We're going to talk today basically about trying to keep the sample good. Actually, this whole chapter about how to take good samples so it really does represent the population. So the definition of sample is just part of a population. There's also this thing called a census, which is the entire population. We just went through a census in this 2020. I don't know if you saw your parents do that. Like every 10 years, I think, the government gathers information about everyone, all sorts of information about everyone to use for things that they need to use for. You're going to hear this word units a little bit in this course. Units are the individual members of the population, so we sample the units. Typically, they're just people. But the population doesn't have to be everyone. The population might be just Mountain View High School or something like that. So those units are those people just in Mountain View High School. And what we're going to talk today is about none of this is going to matter if we don't take a good sample. Okay, so taking a good sample is really key to everything we're going to do in this class. And we're going to talk today and through the chapter about exactly what that means. Okay, so we're going to use this term bias. Okay, so a sampling method is biased if it tends to give samples in which some characteristic of the population is underrepresented or overrepresented. Okay, so in other words, let's see. Notice that bias is in a method. Okay, so I'm going to say that right here. Bias is in the method, not the actual sample. So here's what I mean. Let's say I wanted to take a sample of 100 people at Mountain View High School. So I put everyone's name in a hat and grab 100 names out. It is very possible that in those 100 people, I wind up picking 100 senior females. That would not be a very representative sample of the population. However, there was no bias there. I put all the names in that and I just picked them out. It's just something could happen. You're going to hear me say a lot, anything can happen, anything can happen, anything can happen. But we want the method to be representative of the population. Okay, so we want that sample to be representative of the population, but it might not be even if I did everything right. All right, so there's two different things here. So bias. So notice I overrepresented senior females, right? But I didn't do anything wrong, so there was no bias. However, let's say I went to the quad at lunchtime instead of putting everyone's name in a hat. Wish we had a quad and wish we had people in the quad. But let's say I went to the quad at lunchtime and picked 100 people. It's very possible that that sample is not going to have any seniors in it because the seniors are the ones more likely to leave campus, right? So that would be a biased method because the bias would quite possibly lead to oh gosh, sorry about that. A thick pen there. Let me fix that. that would tend to underrepresent upperclassmen, let's say, if I went to the quad. So notice the difference, right? So how I do it is not a very good way. Now, sometimes, depending on what I want to ask, it might not be a big deal for me to underrepresent seniors. If I was trying to find like what percentage of the population wore glasses, I could probably go to the quad at lunch and ask that question. Because yes, I might underrepresent seniors, but is that really going to matter when I'm talking about glasses? However, if I was going to ask a question like, how many minutes do you spend doing homework? Then that question became more important, and now underrepresenting seniors might be a problem. So that's what bias is. Bias is if you underrepresent or overrepresent. Sometimes bias is okay. Like I said, depending on the question, you might overrepresent people. It's okay. We're going to talk about the best way to do samples, but sometimes we want to do it the easiest way. It's really easy for me to go to the quad and ask 100 people. It's really hard for me to put all the names in a hat or something like that and to pick my 100 people. All right. So we're going to talk just a little bit about types of sampling bias. Now, the book does something that I don't really like. They name these things. I don't like the names because the names are very vague and the names are sometimes can overlap. So what you want to do when someone asks you what kind of bias there is, just describe it. I overrepresent seniors. I underrepresent seniors. That's good enough. Okay. Who are you overrepresenting? So I'm going to give you these words because the book has them. But I would say don't use and this is all, it's hard for me to do any examples here. You just got to read stuff and do stuff on your own. So size bias, there's an example in the book about these lakes where they're trying to, the county wants to, or let's say in Michigan where there's thousands of lakes, right? They want to pick a few lakes to, let's say, do a pollution sample in the lakes or something like that. So the way they pick the lakes, instead of putting names in a hat, which would be not biased at all, they take a map out and they take a coin and they throw a coin onto the map, and whichever lake it falls on, that's the one they go get. Now that's going to overrepresent the bigger lakes, right? There's more likely chance that that coin's going to fall on a bigger lake. Now, is that a problem? I don't know. It depends on what you're doing. Pollution, maybe it's a problem because maybe the smaller lakes are more likely to be polluted. I don't know. So it would just depend on the question. But again, size bias, you're going to hear that term, but I don't use those terms, okay? Just tell me who you're overrepresenting or who you're underrepresenting. There's a voluntary response bias is a really common bias. It's where we give you an option to answer. So like we want to gather data on how you guys are feeling about distance learning. So we send a bunch of letters home and say, please answer these questions. Could be okay, could not be okay, but that's a bias because basically these things, call-in shows are the same thing. Hey, call in and let us know how you feel, or take this poll. These are all voluntary response biases. Not great because they tend to overrepresent people with stronger feelings. If people don't really care, distance learning is fine, whatever. They move it. But if you've got complaints, you're more likely to do. Okay. Convenience sample is what I just said about the quad. Going to the quad is a convenience sample. Asking your friends is a convenience sample. Standing in front of a grocery store is a convenience sample. Again, the word's not super important. It's like I overrepresent underclassmen if I'm in the quad. If I go to the grocery store, I overrepresent, depending on what time I go, right? I overrepresent a certain group of people. If I go during the day, I overrepresent people who aren't working, don't have jobs maybe, who knows? It's hard to know exactly. You're just going to kind of describe what you think is going on. Definition, sorry, this is a definition, not a bias. Sampling frame is just a list of all the possible units. So sampling frame would be all the people in your population. There are some words, questionnaire bias, non-response bias might be people not wanting to answer for some reason. The incorrect response bias might be lying. Questionnaire bias might be how you ask the question. If you phrase the questions in certain ways, you might lead people to answer a certain question. Have you ever looked at when we have elections and they send out these little booklets that have pros and cons for everything, man, it's just like you read these things and you think you're looking at two completely different things. So you can really manipulate a question, get someone to answer it in a certain way by how you phrase the question. Again, none of these words are super important. I do not want you to use these words. They're very vague and they can cover lots of things. I want you to explain. So I'm going to say that again. Make sure you explain, make sure you explain, make sure you explain. Okay, you don't have to use the words. So that's pretty much it for that. One last little thing. down here at the end is I'm just going to, oops. The best way to do a sample is to have everyone have the same chance of being picked, right? All right. So we're going to talk about that in the next section, how you do that. But sometimes that can be a little tricky too. All right. And sometimes it doesn't really matter either, but that's the best way. Everyone has the same chance. And then the last thing for me to say is just a reminder that bias is in the method, not what you get as your sample of people. You can have a perfect method. You can put all the names in a hat, pick out 100, and you can wind up with 100 female seniors. You didn't do anything wrong, but it's just not representative of the population. It's not representative of the population in terms of age and gender, but it might be representative of the population in terms of wearing glasses or something like that. That's why I said sometimes that's okay to do that. Sometimes it's not. So representative sample is different wording than bias. Bias is in the method, not what you come up with at the end. And we'll talk the rest of the chapter about maybe how to take good samples and experiments and that sort of thing. So that's it for 4.1.